Alicia Martinez stood in front of the mirror in the women's restroom on the third floor of Technoplast Industries' corporate building in Chicago, looking at her newly dyed platinum blonde hair and smiling with satisfaction. Not because the color was particularly beautiful, though it was, but because she knew exactly how her direct supervisor, Mr. James Henderson, would react to this provocation, to this unprofessional deviation from his rigid, arbitrary rules about employee appearance. 23 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in business administration from Northwestern University, but nobody in this office knew that. To them, she was just Alicia, the new administrative assistant who had started 3 months ago, shy, quiet, obedient, perfect for being trampled by mediocre managers who confused cruelty with leadership. But Alicia had a secret burning in her chest like a constant fire. She was the daughter of Robert Martinez, the founder and owner of Technoplast Industries, a manufacturing empire valued at $250 million that employed over 2,000 people across the United States. Her father, living in London for the past 5 years, managing international expansion, had been receiving disturbing reports, anonymous complaints, desperate letters, emails from former employees describing a toxic work environment, arbitrary dismissals, systematic harassment. But every time he confronted his management team in Chicago, everyone denied it, presented perfect numbers, brilliant reports, assured him everything was under control. "If you want to know the truth," her father had told her during their last video call 6 months ago, his face aged prematurely by years of business stress, "you'll have to see it yourself. Go there, incognito, without anyone knowing who you are. Find out what's really happening in my company, what they're doing to my people." And so, Alicia had changed her last name from Martinez to Rodriguez on her job application, had omitted her university education from her resume, presenting herself as a simple high school graduate looking for her first real job, and had infiltrated her own family company as a regular employee, observing, documenting, gathering evidence of what she suspected would be much worse than her father imagined. Chapter 2. The Confrontation. She didn't have to wait long. At 9:15 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after arriving at her desk, with her new blonde hair shining under the fluorescent office lights, James Henderson's voice thundered from his corner office. "Rodriguez, in my office now!" The other employees, there were 12 in her administrative department, lowered their eyes to their keyboards, pretending not to hear, not to see, because they knew what was coming. They'd seen it dozens of times before with other employees who committed the crime of some minor transgression against Mr. Henderson's unwritten but absolute rules. Alicia walked toward his office with measured steps, her heart beating with a mixture of feigned nervousness and real satisfaction, knowing that every second of what was about to happen would be recorded by the small audio device hidden in her necklace. Evidence her father would need, evidence that would protect what was going to happen next. James Henderson was 42 years old, had worked at Technoplast for 15 years, rising from floor supervisor to regional manager, and somewhere during that ascent, power had gone to his head in a way that transformed what could have been leadership into tyranny, what could have been firmness into calculated cruelty. He stood behind his desk. His suit was expensive but too tight, revealing a belly that grew with each business lunch paid for by the company. His eyes were small and mean behind designer glasses that cost more than he paid his employees in a month. "What is that?" He pointed at her hair with an accusing finger, as if she'd arrived with a corpse on her head instead of a simple color change. "My hair, Mr. Henderson," Alicia responded in a soft voice, innocent, perfectly calibrated to provoke the response she knew would come. "I dyed it yesterday. I thought it looked nice." "You thought it looked nice?" Henderson's voice rose an octave. His face began reddening in that way Alicia had seen before, when he fired Carmen for wearing a dress he considered too revealing. It reached her knees, when he expelled Miguel for being 3 minutes late after his son was in the hospital all night. "This is a professional office, not a nightclub, not a fashion runway. We have standards, corporate image." The employee handbook doesn't mention restrictions on hair color, Alicia said softly, though she knew this would only enrage him more, knew that men like Henderson weren't interested in written policies or actual rules. They were interested in power, in the ability to make others kneel before their whims. Chapter 3. The Firing, the Employee Handbook. Henderson let out a bitter laugh, full of contempt. Listen to me, little girl. I am the employee handbook here. I decide what's professional and what's not. I decide who stays and who goes. And you know what? You're fired. Pack your things. You have 10 minutes to leave the building. Alicia let her face show shock, let her eyes fill with tears, not real tears of pain, but tears of an actress executing the role of her life, knowing that every reaction, every emotion, would be part of the record, part of the evidence. But Mr. Henderson, I need this job. I have bills to pay. My mother is sick. I don't care about your personal problems, he interrupted, with a dismissive wave of his hand. You should have thought about that before coming in here looking like a, he searched for the most offensive word he could find, like a club girl. Now out of my office. HR will send you your final paperwork. As Alicia exited his office, the main workspace had fallen into sepulchral silence. 12 pairs of eyes watched her with a mixture of sympathy, fear, and relief that this time it wasn't them. This time the axe had fallen on someone else's neck, not their own vulnerable ones. But there was one person who didn't stay silent. Patricia Gomez, 54 years old, working at Technoplast for 22 years, longer than Henderson himself, stood up from her desk with an expression of fury she'd been suppressing for years. This is a disgrace, Patricia said, her voice trembling but strong, cutting through the silence like a knife. You can't just fire people for their appearance. This is discrimination. This is illegal. Henderson turned to Patricia with a smile that was more of a grimace, an expression of cruel triumph because she'd just given him exactly what he wanted. Another reason to flex his power, another opportunity to demonstrate who was in charge. You know what, Patricia? You're fired, too, for insubordination, for disrespect toward authority. Pack your things. Both of you have 10 minutes. The shock in the room was palpable, electric. Patricia, who had dedicated more than 2 decades to this company, who had sacrificed time with her family, who had worked countless overtime hours, who knew the systems better than anyone, fired in an instant for daring to speak up, for daring to defend someone else. Alicia looked at Patricia and saw in her eyes, not regret but defiance, dignity, the kind of courage that comes when you finally decide that some things are more important than a paycheck, that self-respect is worth more than security. Chapter 4. The investigation deepens. That night, in her apartment across town, an apartment she paid for with her own trust fund, not with the miserable salary Technoplast paid its entry-level employees, Alicia reviewed her notes, her recordings, the 3 months of meticulously documented evidence she'd gathered since starting this undercover mission. It wasn't just James Henderson, though he was the worst offender, the most flagrant tyrant. It was a systematic pattern extending throughout the Chicago division. Managers who fired employees for absurd reasons, wearing the wrong color shirt, taking a too long lunch break, 11 minutes instead of 10, having a negative attitude, which meant anything other than constant flattery, being too old, anyone over 45, being too young, anyone who showed ambition or asked questions, being too sick, anyone who used their legally guaranteed sick days. She had documented 14 firings in the last 3 months in her department alone. 14 families destabilized, 14 people struggling to find new employment in a difficult market, 14 stories of unpaid bills, children without enough food, dreams deferred or destroyed, all because mediocre managers on a power trip felt they could play with human lives without consequences. She had spoken with several fired employees after work, meeting in coffee shops, parks, places where they wouldn't be seen by corporate spies, listening to heartbreaking stories. Carlos, a 48-year-old engineer with 3 children, fired because Henderson wanted to hire a friend's nephew and needed to open a position. Maria, a brilliant graphic designer, fired because she refused to work for free on weekends on Henderson's special project, which turned out to be designing his wife's personal website. Jorge, an accountant with 10 years of experience, fired because he discovered irregularities in Henderson's expenses and had the audacity to mention it, not to report him, just to ask if he could clarify it. Tonight, Alicia added 2 more names to her list. Her own, Alicia Rodriguez, according to her employment records, and Patricia Gomez, a woman who had sacrificed more than 2 decades of her life to a company that discarded her in less than 2 seconds. She opened her laptop and began writing an email to her father, attaching audio files, scanned documents, spreadsheets with dates and names, a complete and devastating record of how his company, his creation, his legacy, was being run by people who had absolutely no respect for the values he'd built, no consideration for the human lives that depended on this organization for their survival. Chapter 5. The Father Returns. Robert Martinez read his daughter's email at 3 a.m. New York time, unable to sleep since receiving notification of its arrival, knowing instinctively that what he was about to read would change everything, would confirm his worst fears about what had happened to the company he'd built from scratch 30 years ago. With each file he opened, each recording he listened to, his fury grew, not the explosive fury of a man losing control, but the cold, calculated, and absolutely lethal fury of a man who had been betrayed by people he trusted, who had entrusted his legacy to monsters disguised as professionals. Henderson's voice in the recordings, arrogant, cruel, completely without remorse, was like poison in his ears. The words directed at his daughter, at Patricia, at dozens of other employees whose stories Alicia had documented, weren't simply unprofessional. They were abusive, discriminatory, possibly criminal. And worst of all, he, Robert Martinez, was ultimately responsible. He had been absent, distracted by international expansion, trusting that his management structure would maintain the culture he'd worked so hard to create, a culture of respect, of merit, of giving people opportunities, not crushing them under the heel of middle managers with Napoleon complexes. "I'm coming," he wrote in response to his daughter, his message brief but loaded with intention. "Don't do anything else. Don't reveal who you are yet. I'll be in Chicago in 18 hours. Prepare everything. We're going to clean house." The transcontinental flight gave him time to plan, to consult with his corporate lawyers in New York, to review employment contracts, company policies, Illinois labor laws, every legal detail he'd need to do what he was about to do. Not just fire James Henderson, but completely dismantle the corrupt structure that had allowed his behavior to flourish, that had protected him, that had looked the other way while he destroyed lives. When his plane landed at O'Hare Airport, it was 7 a.m. on a Monday morning. By 9 a.m., he was at the Technoplast corporate building, entering not through the main entrance where he might be seen, but through the executive parking garage, going directly to the 6th floor where the regional director's office was located, an office that technically reported to him, but which for the past 5 years had operated with almost total autonomy while he built operations in Europe. Chapter 6. The Emergency Meeting. "Mr. Martinez, we weren't expecting." Regional Director Edward Russell, a 58-year-old man who had been with the company for 20 years, stood up from behind his desk with an expression mixing genuine surprise with something that might have been fear, as if he knew instinctively that this unannounced visit wasn't to discuss quarterly earnings or expansion plans. "Call a meeting," Robert said without preamble, without greetings, without the warmth he normally brought to professional interactions. "All department managers, all team leaders, main conference room, in 20 minutes, non-negotiable." "All of them?" "But there are more than 30 people. Some are in meetings with clients, some—" "All of them," Robert repeated, his voice like steel. "Either they're in that room in 20 minutes, or they can pack their things now. Their choice." Edward nodded quickly, his hand already reaching for the phone to make the calls, to send the urgent emails that would bring all management running, wondering what was happening, why the absent owner had suddenly returned, what this emergency summons meant. Meanwhile, Robert texted Alicia, "I'm here, ready?" His daughter's response came in seconds. "Ready. Patricia is here outside too. I told her to trust me, that something big was about to happen." "Good. When I give you the signal, come in. Both of you. I want everyone to see what they've done." The main conference room at Technoplast was impressive, designed to impress potential clients, with a mahogany table that could seat 40 people, video screens mounted on the wall, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. In 18 minutes, every requested manager had arrived, filling the room with a nervous murmur of speculation, of concern, of executives accustomed to being in control suddenly feeling off balance, uncertain. James Henderson sat near the center of the table, his posture confident, relaxed. After all, what did he have to fear? His numbers were good because he constantly fired high-salary employees and replaced them with cheaper, inexperienced workers. His reports were impeccable because anyone who questioned his figures was eliminated. He was, according to all official metrics, a successful manager. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Robert entered the conference room with the presence he'd developed during 30 years building a business empire. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He simply walked to the head of the table and silence fell like a heavy blanket. Every person in the room, understanding instinctively that they were in the presence of someone who had absolute power over their careers, their livelihoods, their futures. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm, conversational, almost kind, the type of calm that comes before a storm. "Some of you know me well. Others only know me from photographs on the company website, from annual presentations when I used to come to Chicago more frequently. For those unsure why I'm here, let me be very clear. I've returned because I received reports that the culture of this company, the culture I spent 30 years building, has been corrupted, perverted, turned into something I don't recognize." Nervous glances exchanged around the table, posture adjustments, some faces paling while others tried to maintain neutral expressions. "For the past 3 months," Robert continued, "I've had someone inside this organization, someone I trust absolutely, documenting what really happens here. Not the pretty numbers in your reports, not the polished presentations you send me, but the real, ugly, devastating truth of how you treat the people who work for you. The people whose hard work generates the profits that pay your salaries, your bonuses, your company cars." He paused, letting the tension build, watching as confidence drained from certain faces, especially Henderson's, whose expression had gone from relaxed to cautiously concerned. "I want to share with you some examples of what's been documented, and then I want you to explain to me, the man who built this company from nothing, who put every dollar I had into creating it, how the hell this was allowed to happen." He pressed a button on his laptop, and the first audio recording began to play. Henderson's voice was unmistakable, clear, cruel. "You're fired. You should have thought about that before coming in here looking like a club girl." Henderson's face went white as paper. His eyes widened with recognition and growing horror as more recordings followed. His voice firing Patricia, his voice mocking an employee for being too old, his voice threatening someone who asked about unpaid overtime. But Henderson's recordings were just the beginning. Robert had compiled evidence from across the management team, conversations where they talked about getting rid of problematic employees, problematic meaning anyone who asked questions, discussions about how to manipulate performance reviews to justify firings that were really based on personal prejudice, even some truly horrific text messages where managers laughed about the employees they fired, making jokes about cleaning deadwood and upgrading the office aesthetic. Chapter 8. The Judgment. The silence in the room after the recordings finished was absolute, complete. The kind of silence that comes when a group of people simultaneously realize they've been exposed, that their worst actions have been captured, preserved, turned into irrefutable evidence against them. Now, Robert said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that could cut steel. "I want to introduce you to the person who documented all of this. The person who sacrificed 3 months, working for minimum wage, enduring your abuses, gathering evidence because I asked her to find out the truth." He texted Alicia, "Now." The conference room doors opened, and Alicia and Patricia entered. Alicia no longer wearing the simple, cheap clothes of an administrative assistant, but a designer business suit that showed exactly who she really was. Her blonde hair freshly styled professionally, her posture radiating confidence and authority. Henderson's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he recognized her. When understanding arrived, the girl he'd fired so casually yesterday, the employee he'd treated with contempt, wasn't who he thought she was, wasn't who any of them thought she was. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert said with a gesture toward his daughter, "allow me to formally introduce Alicia Martinez, my daughter, graduate with distinction from Northwestern University with a master's in business administration. And as of today, the new Chief Operating Officer of Technoplast Industries, Chicago Division." The shock in the room was palpable, electric. Some managers looked ready to faint, others looked angry, betrayed, as if she were the villain for exposing them rather than them being villains for their actions. Henderson tried to speak. His voice came out as a croak. "Mr. Martinez, this is taken out of context. I was only... Company rules require..." "Company rules?" Robert interrupted, his voice now rising for the first time, contained fury finally breaking through to the surface. "What company rules? Show me where in any official policy it says you can fire someone for their hair color. Show me where it says you can destroy someone's career because you don't like their attitude. Show me where it says you can play with people's lives like they're chess pieces in your little power game." Henderson had no answer, because no answer existed, no justification, no defense. "Patricia," Alicia spoke for the first time, her voice strong, clear, full of the authority of someone who can finally reveal who they really are. "Would you please join us at the table? You have something to say to these people." Patricia, who had been standing near the door with an expression of total amazement at the revelation of Alicia's true identity, walked forward with dignity, with the grace of someone who knew that her defense of what was right, though it cost her job, was about to be vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. Chapter 9. The Cleanup. "In the 22 years I worked for Technoplast," Patricia began, her voice trembling slightly at first, but strengthening with each word, "I watched this company transform from a place where people loved to work, where they felt valued, where merit mattered, into this." She gestured around the room at the managers who had allowed her to be fired without saying a word, who had participated in or systematically ignored the abuse of power. "I saw good employees, people with families, with mortgages, with kids in college, fired for the most trivial reasons. I saw managers like Mr. Henderson use their position not to lead, but to intimidate. I saw how the numbers in reports looked good because they constantly replaced experienced workers with cheaper novices, sacrificing quality and institutional knowledge for short-term savings that looked good on spreadsheets but destroyed the soul of this organization." She turned to Henderson, her gaze steady, unforgiving. "You fired me yesterday, after 22 years, without a second thought, because I dared to speak up, because I dared to defend someone else. And you know what? I don't regret it, because some things are more important than a job. Dignity is more important. Human decency is more important." Robert nodded, absorbing every word, and then addressed the room. "Effective immediately, the following people are terminated. James Henderson, immediate termination for multiple violations of company policy, unethical conduct, and creation of a hostile work environment." Henderson stood up abruptly. "You can't do this. I have a contract. I'll sue. I know lawyers who..." "Go ahead," Robert said coldly. "Sue. I have 3 months of recordings documenting your behavior. I have testimony from 14 former employees. I have emails and text messages. Please take it to court. I'd love for a judge to hear exactly what kind of person you are. Henderson collapsed back into his chair, reality finally penetrating. He was finished, not just at Technoplast, but probably in any respectable managerial position, because this story would spread, because in the age of social media, these kinds of scandals had a way of going viral. Robert continued around the room, naming 5 more managers who would be terminated, 7 others who would be demoted and placed on 90-day probationary review, making it clear that the culture of impunity, the era of treating employees as disposable, was over absolutely and permanently. And now, Robert said, his tone softening slightly, I want to talk about reparations. Alicia, the list, please. His daughter opened a folder and began reading names. Patricia Gomez, reinstated immediately with full back pay plus compensation for emotional distress. Carlos Jimenez, contacted for re-employment offer with formal apology and compensation. Maria Sanchez, same. The list continued. 14 names, 14 families whose lives had been upended, whose careers had been interrupted, who had suffered financial and emotional stress because mediocre managers decided that power over others was more important than basic decency. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. 3 months later, the Chicago division of Technoplast Industries looked very different, felt different, breathed different. The air itself seemed lighter without the constant weight of fear and intimidation that had choked the creativity, loyalty, and productivity that had always been the real secret of the company's success. Alicia sat in the office that had been Henderson's, now completely redecorated, the former occupants' ego photographs replaced by images of real employees doing real work, of teams collaborating, of the Technoplast founding family, which prominently included a photo of her grandfather, who had started the business in a small workshop in 1985 with nothing more than skill, determination, and belief in treating people right. The most visible change was the completely overhauled Human Resources Department. No longer an enforcement arm for tyrannical managers, but a true resource for employees, with an anonymous hotline, quarterly culture surveys, and most importantly, protection against retaliation for anyone who reported misconduct. Patricia had been promoted to Senior Operations Manager, not as charity, not as apology, but because her 22 years of experience and her proven moral courage made her exactly the kind of leader the new Technoplast needed. The 14 employees who had been unjustly fired had all been contacted. 12 had accepted offers to return with back pay, bonuses, and formal written apologies. 2 had found other opportunities they preferred, but Robert had sent them compensation packages anyway, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Employee turnover, which had been at 47% annually, a disaster that Henderson had hidden in his reports by creative accounting, had dropped to 8% in just 3 months. Productivity had actually increased, despite firing several managers, proving what Alicia had suspected all along. Good people do better work when they're not living in constant fear. The story had gone viral, of course. Social media had exploded with Technoplast truth. Business journals had written case studies. Alicia had been invited to speak at conferences about ethical leadership and corporate accountability. But the real satisfaction wasn't the public recognition. It was the email she received one evening from an employee she'd never met, a warehouse worker in their Michigan facility who had heard the story and wrote, "Thank you for caring enough to see the truth. Thank you for risking your own comfort to protect people you didn't even know. You've given me hope that not all wealthy people are out of touch, that some still remember what it's like to be vulnerable, to need a job, to be at the mercy of someone else's whims. My manager isn't as bad as Henderson was, but she's not great either. But now I know, now we all know, that if we speak up, someone will listen." That changed everything for me. Alicia printed that email and framed it, hanging it on her office wall next to her degrees, her awards, all the markers of professional achievement. Because that email reminded her why she'd done this, why the discomfort of 3 months pretending to be someone she wasn't, the humiliation of Henderson's contempt, the risk of exposure before she'd gathered enough evidence. All of it had been worth it. That night, sitting in her real apartment, not the modest one she'd rented for her undercover role, video calling with her father who was back in London, they shared a moment of quiet satisfaction. "You did good, kid," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Better than good. You saved the company I built. Not the financial part, that was never really at risk, but the soul of it, the reason I started it in the first place, to create something that treated people with dignity, that gave them opportunities, that made their lives better, not worse. You brought that back." "We brought it back," Alicia corrected gently. "You trusted me to find the truth. You acted on it immediately. You put people before profits, ethics, before comfort. That's not common, Dad, even among people who think they're good." As she ended the call and prepared for bed, Alicia looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her blonde hair had grown out some, the roots showing her natural dark brown. She'd kept the blonde, though, not because she particularly loved the color, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance, dyeing your hair, speaking up, refusing to accept injustice even when it's safer to stay silent, can be the catalyst that changes everything. James Henderson, last she'd heard, was working at a small regional firm for half his previous salary, his reputation destroyed, his arrogance finally checked by consequences he could no longer escape. She felt no pleasure in his downfall, only relief that he could no longer hurt people who depended on their jobs for survival. And technoplast industries continued to grow, to thrive, but now with a culture that matched its founder's original vision, a place where hard work was rewarded, where people were valued, where the color of your hair mattered far less than the content of your character and the quality of your contribution. Because in the end, that's what real success looked like. Not the numbers on a balance sheet, but the lives you improved, the dignity you preserved, the truth you had the courage to expose, even when, especially when, that truth was uncomfortable, dangerous, and cost you something to reveal. If Alicia's courage to stand up for what's right moved you, we have something special. Every week we share powerful stories about ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice, whether it's workplace abuse, family betrayal, or systemic discrimination. From undercover investigations to dramatic courtroom reveals, we bring you narratives that restore your faith in courage and justice.